The phone call lasted 1 minute and 42 seconds. It wasn't my daughter who called. It was him, Jake, my son-in-law, polite, measured, and rehearsed. Claire, I wanted to reach out before you heard it from someone else. This year, we've decided to keep Thanksgiving a little more private. Private. That word hit harder than I expected, like I was suddenly a stranger to the table I used to set. I didn't say anything at first. I just watched the butter soften beside the flour bowl. I'd been prepping the dough for my apple pie since sunrise. It's nothing personal, Jake added, like they always do when it's entirely personal. We're just going in a different direction this year. Different direction. Without me. I could hear Nora's voice in the background, my granddaughter, 11 years old, asking why her sweater was itchy. I heard my daughter, Erin, laughing softly, the warmth I used to belong to. And then Jake said the part that truly finished it. Sometimes your presence just shifts the mood. We thought it might be better this way. I hung up, quietly. I didn't throw the bowl. I didn't cry. I just wiped my hands and walked to the hallway drawer. Inside was a folder, worn at the corners, edges softened by time. Inside the folder, the mortgage documents for the house they lived in, a house I had helped them buy in my name, with my credit. When Jake's startup job still paid in promises, and my daughter was 6 months pregnant, I had never asked for anything back, not even a thank you. But now I'd been uninvited from the very home I helped stand up from dirt. I stared at that folder. Then I glanced at the front door, where the old Thanksgiving wreath still hung. I hadn't changed it yet. Its faded oranges and reds looked tired, like they knew they wouldn't be needed this year. The pie crust cooled behind me. The house smelled like cinnamon and something unspoken. You make people uncomfortable, Claire. That's what he said. But as I slid the folder into my bag and reached for my car keys, I smiled. Because what Jake didn't know is I still hold the mortgage on his piece. Claire adjusted the cuffs of her cardigan and squinted at her grocery list. She didn't need much, just Granny Smith apples, cinnamon sticks, and heavy cream. The rest she had stocked up over the past week, like she always did. It was tradition. She baked her pie the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. That morning, she'd even taken the old ceramic pie dish down from the top shelf, ivory with faded blue trim, a wedding gift from her mother in 1973. She washed it gently, ran a soft towel around the edge, and set it beside the mixer. The smell of cloves already lingered faintly in the kitchen, even though she hadn't opened the spice cabinet yet. Nora always licks the spoon, she murmured to herself, smiling. Can't wait to see her do that again this year. The quietness of the house was comforting, but just a little too loud. Each year since her daughter Erin had married, Claire had been the unofficial sous chef, decorator, and backup babysitter. She would arrive the night before, rolling dough while Nora made place cards out of construction paper. Jake, her son-in-law, would handle the turkey and ask for tips, half listening while scrolling his phone. Erin would handle drinks and playlist duties. They weren't a perfect family, but they'd carved something out, a ritual, a rhythm. But this year, no one had said anything. No invite, no call, not even a passing text. She had waited, brushing it off. Maybe they're just busy. Maybe they assume I know I'm always welcome. But doubt had started creeping in. Like cold air under a door she thought was sealed shut. The silence didn't feel accidental. It felt rehearsed. Still, she carried on. She peeled the apples, thin ribbons curling into the trash. She blended sugar with lemon zest. Her hands moved as if memory had taken over. But that nagging sense in her chest didn't ease. She paused only once, holding the crust up to the sunlight, checking its thinness, and wondered, had she said too much last year? Did she embarrass Erin by asking Jake about his job slump? Was it the wine? The politics? She didn't remember doing anything cruel, only that she'd told Nora bedtime stories and washed dishes with her daughter while the men watched football. She wrapped the crust and placed it in the fridge. At 3:16 p.m, the phone rang. At exactly 3:16 p.m, the caller ID blinked, Jake. Claire almost smiled. Almost. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and answered with warmth in her voice. Hey, Jake! Everything all right? There was a pause, just long enough to feel like a signal. Yeah, hey, Claire. Everything's good, he said, voice flat with a rehearsed edge. I just wanted to touch base before tomorrow. Claire leaned against the kitchen counter, heart rising slightly. Maybe it's about the pie. Maybe Nora wanted to make that cranberry string again. Sure, she said softly. What's on your mind? Jake cleared his throat. In the background, Claire heard the hum of Nora singing, something about turkeys and glue sticks. Then came the sentence that split the week in two. So, this year, Erin and I are doing things a bit differently. It's just going to be us, a smaller group, less stress, you know? Claire blinked. I'm sorry. Jake hesitated. It's nothing personal, really. We've just been feeling like, when you're around, the energy shifts. Erin's been tense lately, and it just feels better to not have me there. Claire finished for him, voice quiet, but firm. Look, he said, this isn't about blame or anything. We just want a calm day. No awkwardness. I hope you understand. Claire didn't say a word for several seconds. She turned toward the pie dough, still waiting on the counter. She stared at the cinnamon stick she hadn't crushed yet. Jake broke the silence again. You're always part of the family, Claire. Just not this Thanksgiving. That last sentence tightened something in her chest. She bit the inside of her cheek. Well, she finally said, I hope the day brings you both peace. Thanks for being understanding. Click. Claire stood still. The house was silent, except for the faint ticking of the hallway clock. She looked down at her hands, still faintly dusted with flour, and placed the phone back in its cradle. She didn't cry. She reached for the pie crust and gently laid plastic wrap over it. Then she picked up the ceramic dish and placed it back in the cupboard. Thanksgiving was cancelled, for her, or perhaps not for her, just without her. Claire stood in the centre of her kitchen, the air around her still warm with cinnamon. But the pie crust was no longer needed, and the silence had taken on a weight. She moved slowly, almost ritualistically, wrapped the dough in wax paper, labelled it. Pie, Claire, 11/22. Then she opened the freezer and slid it in beside last month's leftover stew. The ceramic pie dish sat alone on the counter. She hesitated a second, then washed it clean and dried it by hand, tucking it into the cupboard behind the flour tin. It felt like pressing something back into the past. At the sink, she wiped down the counter, not because it needed it, but because she needed the motion. Her hands moved with the familiarity of habit. But this time, they felt like they were saying goodbye. You're always part of the family, just not this Thanksgiving. The line replayed in her head like static. Claire looked up at the window. Outside, the sycamore leaves drifted slowly to the ground. The wreath on the door barely moved, but one ribbon end had loosened, swaying ever so slightly, like it wasn't quite sure whether to stay or fall. She sat at the kitchen table, reached for her cup of tea, lukewarm now, and cradled it between her palms. This wasn't about one dinner. It was about being silently erased from the traditions she helped build. Last year, she stayed late to do the dishes. The year before, she brought Nora a handmade scarf. The year before that, she patched the leaky pipe under the guest bathroom sink, while Jake meant to call someone, and yet This year she wasn't worth a conversation, just a courtesy call. She pressed a knuckle to her lips, not in sorrow, but in concentration. Then she stood up, walked to the hallway drawer, and opened it slowly. Inside, a worn blue folder, mortgage documents, Claire's name typed neatly at the top. She hadn't looked at them in over a year. She lifted the folder, sat back down, and opened it with care. Line after line, her eyes scanned what she already knew: the house title, the loan terms, her signature as guarantor. You're always part of the family. But she wasn't just part of the family. She was the floor beneath their roof, the signature behind their security. Claire closed the folder, no bitterness in her chest, just a steadiness. She placed it in her handbag. Tomorrow was Thanksgiving, and maybe she didn't have a seat at their table, but she still had something solid. Claire didn't go to bed that night, not right away. Instead, she pulled out the small, mustard yellow file box from the bottom shelf in her bookcase. Dust clung to the lid like forgotten stories. Inside were papers she hadn't touched in years: mortgage revisions, bank letters, a faded photo of Erin in her college graduation cap, beaming in the sun. She traced the edge of the photo with her thumb, then set it aside and unfolded the paper beneath it. A 2009 refinance agreement, her own home, paid off 3 years prior, put back under a mortgage so that Erin and Jake could afford their down payment. Just until the business picks up, Jake had promised back then, one hand on her kitchen table, the other gripping Erin's fingers. Claire didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for guarantees or co-signers. She just nodded, because mothers don't calculate when it comes to their children. They leap. She remembered the day the wire transfer cleared, $94,000 into their joint closing account. The realtor had smiled wide. Jake had hugged her longer than usual. Erin had whispered, "Thank you, Mom," into her hair. Claire never brought it up again. Not when Jake's startup folded 9 months later. Not when Erin had to return to teaching full-time while pregnant with Nora. Not even when they skipped her birthday dinner 3 years in a row. She didn't ask for repayment or recognition. Her reward had been watching Nora learn to walk across the very living room she helped them secure. But now, sitting at her kitchen table in the quiet hum of midnight, Claire realised something painful. She was no longer seen as a builder, just a burden. That wasn't what stung most, though. What stung was this new reality, that her sacrifice had been rewritten as interference. Her presence, once foundational, had become optional, even inconvenient. Claire stood up and walked slowly to her bedroom. From the closet, she pulled a smaller box, one she hadn't opened in years. Inside was her mother's necklace, a note from Erin when she was 8. "Mommy, you are stronger than superheroes," and a folded paper marked "Bank Authorization, Third-Party Notification." She stared at it. This wasn't revenge. Claire didn't want to hurt them, but she also wasn't going to vanish quietly. She had built too much, held too much, for too long. And now, maybe it was time her presence was felt, if not welcomed. The phone buzzed at 7:42 the next morning. Claire was already awake. She'd been sitting by the front window, wrapped in her robe, sipping a second cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The yellow folder still sat on the end table, unopened again. The screen read, "Nora Hart." Claire hesitated. She hadn't expected this, not after the firm line Jake had drawn, not after being uninvited. But she answered. "Hi, sweet pea," she said softly. Nora's voice came bright and fast. "Grandma! Guess what I'm making?" Claire managed a small smile. "Tell me." "A gratitude turkey. It's like a paper one, and you write stuff on each feather." Claire chuckled gently, her throat tight. "That sounds lovely. I wrote your name on the orange feather, Nora said, because Mommy said orange is your favourite. Claire blinked rapidly, looking towards the bookshelf, where an old burnt orange shawl still hung over the armrest. She hadn't worn it in years, but yes, once upon a time, orange had been her favourite. I'm touched, sweetheart, she whispered. That's very special. And guess what else? Nora continued. Daddy said we're not having too many people this year because the oven broke. But Mommy said next year you can come again for sure. So, don't be sad. Claire paused. A dozen thoughts swirled. Truths, excuses, contradictions. She could have corrected her, told her the truth, said that her mother hadn't spoken up, that not too many people meant Claire alone was removed. But this voice, so young, so full of trust, deserved something else. I'm not sad, honey, Claire lied softly. I'm happy you called. I made you a card. It has glitter glue and a drawing of you holding a pie. Claire let out a quiet laugh. That sounds perfect. Can I come over soon and give it to you? The question hung. Claire looked at the calendar. Thanksgiving was tomorrow. Not just yet, love, Claire said gently, but maybe this weekend. Okay, Nora said cheerfully. Love you. Love you too, baby girl. The call ended. Claire sat back, hand still on the phone. On the table beside her, the mortgage documents stared up at her, but now, beside them, she placed something else, an empty envelope, where she planned to keep Nora's card once it arrived, because despite everything, not every bridge had burned. After the call ended, Claire sat for a long moment, hands resting in her lap. Outside, the wind had picked up. Sycamore leaves swirled across the front lawn, gathering at the base of the steps. It reminded her of all the years she'd raked them by hand while Erin played dress-up in the yard. She closed her eyes and let the memories wash through. Autumn afternoons with apple cider, Erin's first scraped knee, the night she stayed up braiding doll hair because Erin had nightmares. She'd given her whole life to loving her child. Not with grand speeches, but with groceries quietly dropped off, babysitting on short notice, checks slipped under rent envelopes in hard months. No one wrote that into a greeting card, but it had held a family together. And now she was told, politely, that she made things tense. Not unlovable, not unworthy, just unwelcome. Claire inhaled deeply and opened her notebook. Not her journal, the lined one by the bedside. This was different. This one had tabs and folders, a spreadsheet tucked in the back, her financial planning book. She flipped past retirement savings, Nora's college fund, and found the tab she hadn't touched in over a year. Property liens, Erin and Jake's mortgage. Her fingers were steady as she scribbled a short line. Reconsider third-party clause. Reach out to Andrew at bank. She didn't circle it. She didn't underline. Just one note. One small intention. Not revenge. Not drama. Accountability. She was tired of the silent assumption that she'd always show up, always support, always absorb disappointment without a ripple. She hadn't said no to Thanksgiving. She had simply not been invited. And now, maybe it was time they remembered what it meant to lean on someone and what it meant when that support was no longer silent. Claire closed the book and placed it neatly in her bag. Then she walked to her small entryway table and took out a blank note card. She wrote 3 words in her delicate handwriting. I heard you. She didn't sign it. She slipped it into an envelope and addressed it to Jake and Erin, not to fight, but to disrupt the silence. She wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a burden. She was a mother. And the things she had done, sacrifices, support, sleepless nights, weren't invisible just because someone else found them inconvenient. Tomorrow, they'd celebrate Thanksgiving. She wasn't sure what they'd be thankful for, but Claire would be thankful for finally seeing things clearly. The next afternoon, Thanksgiving Day, was unusually quiet. No scent of turkey in the oven, no laughter from the TV, just the ticking of the hallway clock and the hum of the refrigerator. Claire sat by the window again, leafing through a gardening magazine she wasn't reading. Then came a knock, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. She opened the door to find Marion, her neighbour from across the street, holding a foil-wrapped pie and a small envelope. "I figured you wouldn't mind a sweet interruption," Marion said with a knowing smile. Claire blinked, then stepped aside. "Come in. You brought back up." She nodded to the pie. Marion settled into the kitchen like someone who'd been there 100 times. She placed the pie on the counter and handed Claire the envelope. "Happy Thanksgiving," she said simply. Claire opened it. Inside was a hand-drawn card, orange and red scribbles, clearly made by a child. "That's from Nora," Marion said. "She ran over this morning while Jake was still on a call, slipped it under my door and asked if I could make sure Grandma saw it." Claire's hand trembled as she traced the glittery turkey handprint. "She doesn't know, does she?" Claire whispered. "Not a thing," Marion replied softly. "But she feels it." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Marion poured tea from the silver kettle Claire rarely used. She even reached for the porcelain teacups Claire had inherited from her mother, the ones she only brought out on holidays. "I didn't mean to intrude," Marion said gently. "I just had a feeling you wouldn't be at Erin's this year." Claire took a breath. "I wasn't invited." She said it so plainly, even she was surprised by the evenness in her tone. Marion didn't gasp or scowl. She simply nodded. "That boy's always had a polite way of excluding people. You never noticed?" Claire looked down. "I noticed. I just thought, maybe if I didn't push back, I'd still be needed." Marion sipped her tea, eyes steady. "You're not a burden, Claire. You're the reason they got that house. You're the reason Erin had help with Nora when Jake was gone that whole month." Claire didn't speak. "You can't make people see your worth," Marion added, "but you can stop letting them treat it like it's optional." Claire looked up, tears threatening but not falling. "I left a note. Not angry, just clear." "Good," Marion said. "Let them sit with silence for once." Claire smiled, small but real. Marion had left by 5:30, just as the light outside began to dim. Claire stood at her kitchen window again, cradling the now lukewarm cup of tea. Her eyes lingered on the front yard. The wind had swept the leaves across the sidewalk, forming a slow spiral near the mailbox. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel quite as hollow. On the table, Nora's card still sat open. The glitter around the paper handprint had begun to flake slightly, leaving specks of gold on the wood grain. Claire ran a fingertip gently across the centre, where Nora had drawn a pie in her hands. "You remembered," Claire murmured, almost to herself. She reached for the yellow financial folder, then, after a brief pause, walked down the hall to the den. At the base of the bookcase, tucked beneath tax folders and estate documents, sat a cedar box, one she hadn't opened in years. It smelled faintly of old wood and peppermint oil. Inside were pieces of a life no one else remembered, a broken locket from her late husband, a recipe card in her mother's handwriting, Erin's preschool photo tucked behind a hospital band, marked Claire, maternity wing. She paused, then gently added 2 things: the mortgage documents, neatly reclipped and folded, and beside them, Nora's glittered card, face up. She didn't organise them chronologically, she didn't annotate, she simply pressed them together, old structure and new love, into one box. "This is what I've built. Not a house, not just a loan, a through line, a legacy." Claire closed the lid slowly, resting her palm on top for a moment, as if sealing in something deeper than paper. She turned walked back into the kitchen, and picked up her small, spiral-bound notebook. A new page, she wrote. Legacy is not who gets the credit. It's what endures without applause. She stared at the line, then underlined endures. Then, without a second thought, she opened her laptop, logged into the banking portal, located Jake and Erin's account number tied to the property. She didn't press freeze yet. She didn't cancel anything, but she started composing an email, short, polite, and impossible to ignore. This is Claire. I'd like to schedule a review of the secondary guarantor terms on the Gregory Street loan. She left it unsigned. She wasn't acting out of spite. She was moving with intention, and when a foundation shifts quietly beneath your feet, you don't always notice until the walls begin to speak. Claire's fingers hovered above the send button. The banking email sat open on the screen, simple, professional, with no tone of threat. Just a request for review. She had typed it like she'd done 100 others before, clean, factual, efficient. But as her cursor moved to the final keystroke, her phone buzzed, just once. She glanced down. New message from Erin, 6:12 p.m. Claire didn't touch it immediately. She stared at the name for a beat too long. Finally, with a sigh, she tapped to open it. Mum, please don't stir things up. We're trying to keep things peaceful. Just give us space, please. No greeting, no happy Thanksgiving, no invitation to talk. Just distance, dressed up as diplomacy. Claire exhaled, her hand dropping from the mouse. The email remained unsent. She reread the message, once, then again. Give us space. The phrasing stung, not because it was cruel, but because it was calculated. Erin knew exactly how to phrase things in a way that sounded gentle, even as they shut the door. Claire leaned back in her chair, eyes flicking to the wall clock. The second hand made a soft tick with every sweep. Space. That's what she'd already given. She gave them space to buy the house, by pulling equity from her own. She gave them space after Jake lost the business, by covering groceries and bills without ever being asked. She gave them space when Nora was born, stepping in as babysitter, chauffeur, even night nurse. Now they asked for space as if it was something new. Peace, Claire muttered, echoing the word from Erin's message. Or silence. She stood up, walking slowly toward the window. Outside, a neighbour's house flickered with warm golden light, silhouettes moving inside, laughing. Family gathered, a table set, the familiar rhythm of belonging. Claire's hand still held the phone. She didn't reply, but she didn't delete the message either. Instead, she returned to the laptop and saved the draft. Not sending it yet wasn't surrender. It was strategy, because now she saw clearly this wasn't just about Thanksgiving. It was about a pattern. And patterns don't break from confrontation. They shift from clarity. She walked back to the cedar box, opened the lid, and placed the phone inside. Screen down, message unread again. Then she closed it gently and said aloud to no one, "You want space? Fine, but I decide how far." The morning after Thanksgiving, the sun rose slow and orange across Claire's front steps. She didn't rush to dress. She didn't make coffee. She just moved with purpose. In her hand was a worn bank passbook, the kind most people stopped using a decade ago, but Claire liked records, paper, ink, a trail. She drove to the credit union, not the commercial bank, where she still kept a private account, separate from the mortgage-linked ones. The manager, Andrew, greeted her like an old friend. "Claire, been a while. You're here for the box?" She nodded. They went into the back vault. Inside the safety deposit box, she kept only a few things: a deed from her old condo in San Jose, the savings bond her father left her, and a small envelope marked in her handwriting, "Contingency for Nora." She took it out and held it, then looked Andrew in the eye. I want to update the beneficiary structure, move this into a trust, one that can't be redirected by any family member but myself. He paused, understanding. Everything all right? Claire smiled faintly. It will be. They sat down in his office. She outlined the new structure. Nora as future beneficiary, Claire as sole trustee, no joint access, no assumption of guardianship from Erin or Jake. When it was done, Andrew handed her the printed summary. You're being thoughtful, he said. Claire shook her head. I'm being honest. With myself. She left the bank lighter, not in emotion, but in clarity. At home, she made a single copy of the document and sealed it in a labelled envelope. Then she wrote a note, attached gently to the front. For the day she asks what I did for her. No dramatics, no confrontation, just truth. Preserved. Then Claire cleaned the guest bedroom. Not because anyone was coming to stay, but because the act of preparing space reminded her she still had room for love, for future, for something more than waiting to be invited. She stood at the doorframe when she finished and whispered, "No more shrinking." Outside, the wind rustled the trees. A bird landed on the fence, then took off again, quiet but certain, just like Claire. She hadn't sent the email to the bank holding the mortgage. Not yet. But now she had control of something they hadn't even thought to ask about. The next move. Claire was sitting at the dining table, carefully reviewing the updated trust papers, when the phone rang. It was Erin. She paused, then answered. Hi, sweetie. The voice that responded wasn't hers. Claire, this is Jake. Claire's grip on the pen tightened. I thought Erin was calling. She asked me to speak first. Did she? Jake cleared his throat. Look, we saw the login attempt to the mortgage portal. I get it. You're upset. Claire's voice stayed calm. I didn't realise you monitored that closely. We just want to make sure everything's stable, okay? We've got plans, Claire. Renovations, some refinancing. We can't have surprises right now. Claire said nothing. It's not like we're cutting you out. You're still part of Nora's life. As long as I don't show up to holidays, she replied. Jake hesitated, then softened his tone. Erin's under a lot of stress. You and she, you just see things differently. At that moment, Claire heard murmuring in the background. Then Erin's voice cut through faintly. Just tell her we're not changing the whole house dynamic again. This is our space now. She's not the matriarch anymore. The words weren't shouted, but they were clear. Jake didn't realise Claire had heard them. He kept talking. Maybe after the new year we could find time for a brunch or something casual. No pressure. Claire closed her eyes, and then quietly she said, Put Erin on the phone. There was a pause. Then Erin picked up. Mom? I heard what you said, Claire said evenly, about the matriarch, about your space. I didn't mean it like that, Erin replied, her voice suddenly strained. I just meant, we're trying to have boundaries. Jake and I need to make decisions without feeling overseen. Claire waited. It's not about not loving you, Erin added, voice softening. I just never had a space of my own growing up. I always wanted that. Our home, it finally feels like it's ours. For a flicker of a second, Claire saw her, not as a manipulator, but as a girl still trying to build something she never had. But she also knew this. You don't get to build your home by erasing the foundation that made it possible. Thank you for telling me, Claire said quietly. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. The house was quiet again. Claire sat back at her kitchen table, the same place where she had once folded baby clothes for Erin, ironed her late husband's shirts, and baked birthday cakes for years that no one mentioned anymore. The The trust documents lay stacked neatly to her left. A candle flickered low on the counter, its scent of apple and spice fading into the November chill. She opened the small, spiral-bound notebook again, the same page she had written on days earlier. Legacy is not who gets the credit, it's what endures without applause. She let her pen hover under the last line. Then, slowly, deliberately, she wrote beneath it, "This is my space. I just stopped shrinking to fit yours." She underlined shrinking, because for years she had done just that. She had softened her voice when Jake rolled his eyes. She had stepped aside when Erin forgot her birthday, claiming exhaustion. She had offered silence where disappointment should have lived. And now she realised every time she did, she made their lives easier. At the cost of hers. She flipped back a few pages in the notebook and reread her earlier thoughts. Questions about what kind of mother she'd been, doubts about whether she'd been too much or perhaps not enough. But now there were no questions, only a quiet kind of knowing. Claire rose and walked to the fireplace mantel. There, in a silver frame, sat a photo from a Thanksgiving 15 years ago. Erin, mid-20s, holding a pie, Claire beside her, smiling proudly. Jake at the corner, barely in the frame. Nora wasn't born yet. Claire stared at her own face in the photo. "That woman tried," she whispered. "She gave." She didn't remove the photo. She simply slid it slightly, so the edge of the frame no longer hid her hand on Erin's shoulder. A symbolic shift. She returned to the table and placed her hand flat on the folder. Then she looked at her phone. No new messages, no apology, no invitation, just stillness. And in that stillness, Claire found a truth that neither Jake nor Erin had spoken, but she now owned fully. They didn't need to make room for her anymore, because she already had a room of her own. And it was no longer built inside their house, it was built inside herself. The bank was unusually quiet for a Monday. Claire arrived early, as always, with her file folder tucked under one arm and a soft wool scarf around her neck. She greeted the receptionist by name and waited, her eyes calm. Her appointment was with the loan specialist, a follow-up on the trust's banking structure, mundane, if not for the timing. Across the lobby, the elevator doors opened. Claire looked up, then froze, just for a moment. Jake and Erin. He was in a blazer, holding a folder. Erin wore a soft grey coat and her usual tense smile. They were clearly here for a meeting, one Claire hadn't been told about. Their eyes locked. Erin blinked first. Jake's mouth tightened, as if he'd just bitten down on a sentence and changed his mind. Claire nodded once. No smile, no frown, just acknowledgement. The receptionist, suddenly aware of the trio, stood straighter. "Mrs. Bennet, we're ready for you now. Mr. Carson will join you shortly." Erin glanced sideways. "You have a meeting?" Claire turned to her daughter, her voice cool but steady. "Just updating some documents. Quiet Monday." Jake stepped forward, uncertain. We have a pre-approval discussion. Looking at expanding the kitchen. Nora wants a breakfast nook." Claire tilted her head. "With what collateral?" He flinched, just slightly. Claire wasn't asking out of spite. It was a technical question, a banker's question. The one she had every right to ask, because her name still sat on the property deed, still backed the original mortgage. Erin spoke up, trying to smooth the tension. "It's just exploratory. They said you didn't need to be involved." Claire nodded, polite. They were mistaken. And then, without another word, she turned and walked with the loan officer into the side conference room. Jake and Erin remained in the lobby, stiff, small. Inside the meeting room, Mr. Carson, mid-50s, respectful, settled in across from her. "I understand there's a secondary party interested in leveraging the home for additional lines. Claire slid the trust documents forward. That won't be happening. He reviewed the files, then looked up, surprised. Understood. I'll mark the file accordingly. Claire didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. She simply folded her scarf, placed it back in her lap, and waited while the papers were stamped. Outside the glass wall, Jake stood motionless. Erin leaned in to say something to him. Whatever it was, it didn't fix anything, because now, for the first time, they understood. Claire wasn't the one asking for permission anymore. Claire waited 5 more minutes after the meeting ended, reviewing the printouts Carson had provided. She gathered her documents with care, slid them back into her folder, and adjusted her scarf. As she opened the door to leave, something caught her eye. The side table by the wall, where brochures and pens were stacked, had a small drawer, half open. She wouldn't have looked, would have just walked past. But a glint of soft graphite caught her eye, handwritten, faint. Curious, she pulled open the drawer further. Inside, nothing but a folded piece of receipt paper, torn on one edge. On the back, scrawled in what could only be Erin's handwriting, lightly pressed with pencil, it wasn't supposed to be like this. That was all. No name, no date, no mom. But Claire recognised the slope of the T and the way the like curled upward at the end. She had helped Erin practice cursive on worksheets in 3rd grade. That tilt hadn't changed. Claire sat down on the edge of the bench nearby, the note in her hand. The graphite was smudged. She must have written it quickly, maybe nervously, maybe while Jake was distracted. Claire looked back at the conference room, now empty. Erin and Jake had left without saying goodbye, but this was a goodbye of another kind. Or maybe an apology that couldn't survive aloud. She turned the paper over. On the other side, faint ink bled through. Home equity adjustment, requested December. That was the document Jake had submitted, and Erin had attached her regret to the back of it. Reverse frame symbol, trademark. Claire suddenly remembered the stack of bills she used to tuck behind the sugar tin at home. Same fold, same corner curl. She would write tiny notes on them to herself. Mortgage in full by March. Don't let Erin see you worried. She had carried burdens Erin never saw. Now, Erin was carrying silence Claire couldn't fix. Claire didn't cry. She folded the receipt again and slipped it into her bag, between the trust paperwork and her notebook. Not to confront, not to expose, just to remember that somewhere beneath the boundaries and brunches and whispered dismissals, her daughter still felt something. And that mattered, even if they never spoke of it. The sun had shifted by the time Claire returned home. It filtered through the lace curtains in the living room, painting soft rectangles across the floor. She set down her bag gently, toes slipping out of her low-heeled shoes. A hush wrapped the house, as if it too was exhaling. She walked down the hallway. The 3rd door on the right had once been Erin's room. Pink wallpaper, long painted over, posters replaced by framed prints, a twin bed exchanged for a soft reading chair, and a pale blue rug she'd picked up during her first solo trip to Maine. Claire stepped inside and sat. The room still smelled faintly of lavender. On the shelf, old children's books, a chipped mug with number 1 Mom in faded gold. Erin had given it to her at 12. Claire had kept it through everything. She pulled out her notebook from her bag and opened to a fresh page. She sat still, letting the silence speak first. Then she wrote, "Let them have the kitchen. I've rebuilt the foundation." She paused, wrote it again, slower. "Let them have the kitchen. I've rebuilt the foundation." Jake had talked about knocking down walls, adding granite, creating flow. Erin had spoken of claiming space, shaping their home to reflect their independence, but what they didn't realise was Claire had already done all that. Not with countertops, but with sacrifices no one ever saw, with debts quietly paid. with hugs given even when love was uneven. This room, her room now, wasn't about nostalgia. It was about peace, and peace doesn't beg to be kept at the table. It builds its own. Claire reached toward the small window and cracked it open. A cool breeze slipped in, rustling the corner of the page. Outside, a squirrel darted across the yard, chasing nothing but sunlight. She leaned back, eyes open, mind clear, not waiting for an apology, not expecting understanding, just knowing that the house she built, whether with bricks or broken expectations, was still standing. And she was too. A week passed. No calls, no texts, no surprise drop-ins with flowers or vague invitations to talk when ready. Claire watered her plants, paid the utility bills, went to the market on Wednesday as usual. She smiled at the mailman, laughed with the pharmacist. The rhythms of life beat quietly forward until Friday afternoon. The doorbell rang. No one was there, just a small envelope, slightly wrinkled, tucked under the welcome mat. It was addressed in crayon. Claire's heart caught. She bent to pick it up and brought it inside, peeling back the paper with careful fingers. Inside was a folded sheet of printer paper, the kind schools used for colouring projects. At the top corner, Family Day Project, Grade 2, in typed font. But everything else was unmistakably Nora. Bright strokes of marker and pencil, a house with flowers, a front porch, a window with lace curtains, a little girl drawn with 2 pigtails, and a bright yellow dress stood next to an older woman with a silver bun. Above their heads, in lopsided purple letters, "Grandma's house makes me feel safe." Claire sat down on the couch. Not on the edge. This time she let herself sink into it. Tears didn't come immediately. First came the warmth, the sense that someone, somewhere had told the truth out loud, even if they didn't know it was brave. She flipped the paper over. On the back was a tiny note in Nora's handwriting. "I miss your spaghetti. Mommy said maybe we can come next month." Claire traced the words with her thumb. There were no promises, just a maybe. And from Erin, still nothing. But Nora's words carried something else, continuity, the kind that doesn't ask permission from adults with prideful hearts. It simply remembers where it felt held, where the light came through the curtains just right, where bedtime stories ended with kisses that didn't cost anything. Claire placed the drawing on the fridge, next to a grocery list and an expired coupon. No fanfare, just where it belonged, because the story wasn't over, and maybe, just maybe, the next generation still knew where the centre of the home lived. Saturday morning brought a soft sun and a gentle breeze. Claire wrapped her scarf around her shoulders and walked the 3 blocks to the local library. It was story time, something she hadn't attended in years. But Nora's drawing still sat proudly on the fridge, and something about it had stirred an old rhythm inside her. The children's section buzzed with quiet energy, crayons rolling off tables, little sneakers padding across carpets, and parents murmuring behind shelves. Claire didn't sit up front. She chose the armchair in the corner, by the tall window, where light streamed in through sheer curtains. She liked that it reminded her of the room she had made her own. The story today was The Patchwork Path. A librarian with soft curls read aloud, holding the book high as kids leaned forward, captivated by tales of family, tradition, and quilts sewn with memory. Next to Claire, a little girl, maybe 5, slid into the empty chair. She had a glittery backpack and hair in neat coils. The girl looked up at Claire, studying her thoughtfully. "Are you someone's grandma?" Claire smiled gently. She didn't expect the question, but she also didn't need to rehearse the answer. "Yes, and I'm someone's home too." The little girl grinned like she understood. Not the whole thing, but enough. She leaned against Claire's side, as if they'd done this a dozen times before. Claire didn't move, didn't question it, just let the warmth of small trust fill the space between them. A mother nearby noticed and gave Claire a small smile, not one of concern, but recognition. Claire closed her eyes briefly, listening to the librarian's voice rise with emotion at the story's end, and when she wrapped the quilt around her shoulders, she remembered who she came from. Legacy doesn't always come in wills, or bank accounts, or even last names. Sometimes it comes in the way a child rests against you when they feel safe, or in how a question, asked innocently, unlocks a truth you didn't know you needed to say aloud. Yes, and I'm someone's home too. That sentence stayed with Claire the rest of the day. More than any apology, more than any holiday dinner, it was the kind of truth that outlives pain, because roots don't die when cut off from a branch. They wait, they deepen, they hold. The bank lobby was nearly empty by late afternoon. Jake stood at the front counter, shifting his weight between polished shoes, tapping his thumb against the strap of his briefcase. He was here alone. Erin had stayed home. The loan officer, Carson, was running behind, so Jake was directed to wait in the client lounge just past the glass divider. He moved toward the row of seats by the wall and stopped. There, resting on the small side table, was a worn leather portfolio, dark chestnut, edges frayed, brass clasp dulled with time. Jake's brow furrowed. He knew that case, not from now, but from before. He'd seen Claire clutch it, walking into PTA meetings. He remembered her holding it the day Erin gave birth, running into the hospital with it tucked under her arm, papers sticking out. It was more than a folder. It was a vessel of responsibility, of preparation, of things no one else had thought to bring. And now it sat here, quiet, forgotten, or left intentionally. Jake's fingers hovered over it, but he didn't touch. He looked around the room. No one else noticed, but the echo inside him was loud. He turned his gaze to the window, where his reflection blurred against the glass. For a moment, he didn't see a husband or a homeowner. He saw a boy sitting at Claire's kitchen table, filling out college loan forms, while she brewed coffee and highlighted due dates in 3 different colours. He never asked how she knew all that. She just did. Jake exhaled, long and low. His shoulders dropped, not from fatigue, but from something heavier, realization that people like Claire don't always announce when they leave the room. They just take their gravity with them. A bank associate approached. "Mr. Reardon." Jake blinked and straightened. "Yes." He followed the associate down the hall but cast one more glance back. The portfolio hadn't moved, but something inside him had. It was a Sunday morning in December. Outside, frost glazed the mailbox, and the last of the maple leaves clung to branches like tiny orange hands refusing goodbye. Inside, the house was warm. Claire's kitchen smelled of cinnamon and flour. The radio played a soft jazz tune, the kind with no lyrics, just comfort. At the counter, Nora stood on a step stool, sleeves rolled up, stirring a large bowl of batter with intense concentration. "Not too fast, sweetheart," Claire said gently. "Let the spoon guide you, not the other way around." Nora giggled. "It's like a dance." Claire smiled. "Exactly." They worked in rhythm, one measuring, one mixing, occasionally stealing tastes when they thought the other wasn't looking. A light knock came at the door. It was Erin. She didn't come in. Just handed off a forgotten backpack for Nora, offered a polite nod, and left. No words about the holiday, no apology, just the action. Claire didn't flinch. She closed the door quietly and returned to the kitchen. Nora looked up from her bowl. "Grandma?" "Yes, baby." "What does foundation mean?" Claire paused. wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her eyes drifted towards the floorboards beneath her feet, the ones she'd scrubbed, cried on, stood her ground on. She knelt beside Nora. Foundation is what holds everything up, even when no one sees it. It keeps things standing when storms come. Nora tilted her head, like the bottom of a house. Claire nodded. Yes, and sometimes, like the heart of a home. Nora smiled slowly, then turned back to her bowl. Claire stood, watching her stir. She thought of Jake's hesitation at the bank, of Erin's silence, of all the Thanksgivings she'd cooked, even when her back ached and her name wasn't printed on the invitation. She thought of Nora, of this moment, of how legacy isn't what you leave in your will, but what you leave in the room long after you've stopped speaking. Claire didn't need a place at their table. She had built her own, and right now, at her table, the next generation was learning the recipe.